So let's talk about the T1 stuff now, because part of how this all ties in terms of player history and player storylines is that you are actually the perfect person to discuss all of this, because all of these people are from StarCraft, which you used to cast. So if we talk about your knowledge of kind of player history, well, turns out that Poult, the current GM of T1, is coming in from StarCraft. We have some, previous people like Zephyr, who have playing histories in League of Legends, who then transitioned into coaches. We even have current players on the roster who are related to StarCraft, like Gumayushi is the younger brother of Innovation, which is like one of the coolest stories I think that's ongoing in esports if you care about esports history. And now Stardust is the new interim coach, who is also coming from StarCraft. So for those people who don't know the whole circumstance, because this all ties into the circus that was the LS, preseason coaching fiasco, how Dany and Zephyr got in charge of this team, Poult as the GM selecting everybody, now these other StarCraft players who are now coaches from the academy team coming up to represent the current team. So why don't you weave us a tale of this year in T1 and how we got to this point?
So there was obviously the start of things was there were a lot of rumors that LS was going to be the coach, right? That's kind of where we started the year off, and like the end of the off season was kind of pointing towards that. And then there was the leak, right? There was a leak from, I don't remember who it was. It might have been one of the players was about to leave the team. It was on Discord, that leak that LS was joining and Poult was joining. And so there was a lot of backlash, right? LS ended up not becoming the coach. He took a little bit of a break. Then he kind of announced he's a streamer for T1. He's going to be doing co-streams and stuff like that. Poult joined the team, it was announced. And then shortly afterwards, they announced Dany coming in with Zephyr. And that was like the big moment of like, okay, it was going to be us. Everyone's mad. And then now we have top coaches. And you're getting some down one key of power in here. So I felt like, okay, we spent the big money last second, right before the season starts. We got the good stuff, so don't worry. That's kind of how the season started. And then, as everybody knows, T1 has a maximum player roster. So they have actually the full limit of players, which I believe is 10 for an LCK roster. So they have, basically every player has a double, except the jungle, which has 2, and Keria does not. Keria does not have a support. He does now. It was announced today that they're bringing up Hoyt, actually from the Challengers roster, so he'll be now Keria's substitute.
By the way, how do you like that? How do you like being any of those other players, including Faker? And they're like, listen, if you play bad, there's a sob. And then Keria's like, what about me? And they're like, just play well. Like, I'm the best. I am the best. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, what's that situation? Why does it not? It's one for everyone.
Yeah.
I'll get to my take.
Is the best player on that team, but anyway,
I'll get to my take on why Hoyt might come up later. But anyway, so that's kind of the story has been that there's a lot of players, right, and there's a lot of shuffling. And throughout spring, there were some struggles. They weren't dominant. They actually had a pretty bad record at the beginning. So Dany, actually, I guess I should preface this by explaining that when there's a head coach in Korea, it means that you're basically the boss, you're the manager. What you do with that power is actually up to you, and lots of different teams do different things. But when you're the head coach, you're usually not on the day-to-day. You're not actually looking at the drafts. You're not the guy who's on stage. You're not the guy who's got the clipboard, right? Like, that's not...
You're the GM.
You're like above that guy. You're the GM, essentially. And sometimes you don't act as it, but...
Here's the funny thing, like... Because the head coach is basically what we would term as a GM in the West, I don't actually know what Poult's job is in a Korean team, being the GM, when the head coach is basically the GM in a Korean context.
So my take, because that part is like a little bit murky from the outside looking in, I don't even know, but my take is that Poult is kind of like, he's overseeing some decisions as a traditional GM, but he's also kind of like the face of the team in terms of PR decisions. And the reason I say that is because he was the one who... went to the press conference and actually answered the questions when the coaching staff change was made. So he did kind of act as a GM in that sense. But what I'm trying to say here is there's a big distinction between Zephyr and Dany. And Dany has been kind of the face of the team. And because he's on stage, he's the one who's doing the drafts, he's the one who's doing the player swaps, and he's been very public about this. And what's really interesting about Dany is that he's been, I think, the most transparent coach, whether if he's telling the truth in fact, that we have ever seen in like Korean League of Legends or maybe even Korean esports. He's doing interviews every week, sometimes multiple times a week, talking about why he's made his swaps or what's going on in scrims or why he thinks the players are having problems. And while some of it might just be PR speak and not true, it's been amazing for me as a caster because I've been able to say, well, he said this and they did this. And then next week he said this and he said they were going to do this, but then they didn't do it. So what's true? Like, it's been really interesting to have that as a caster where you can actually literally have quotes from a coach and bring that up, because oftentimes you're just kind of going on hearsay or speculation or your personal opinion on your analysis on the game. But at the very end of Dany's time, after doing a billion roster swaps, he said, this is the roster. And he used the roster they used for spring playoffs. And then he made a few changes between Teddy and Gumusi there at the very end. And he basically said the players are not doing what we talked about in scrims. We're talking about decision-making problems on the Rift, where there's a lot of problems of indecisiveness, shot calls aren't being followed. And we know this is a problem, and we've addressed it. It's working in scrims. But when we go to our professional games, it isn't really happening so much. And that was kind of like the last few things he said publicly about where the team was. And then suddenly, just like out of nowhere, right when they're in the middle of the roster, I wake up one morning and everybody's blowing up my phone, be like, did you see the news? Did you see the terminations? And that's when Stardust got moved into essentially Dany's position. And then Moment came up as his substitute coach.
And by the way, Stardust also a former StarCraft 2 player.
Yes, yep. Stardust was a pretty well-known player who played in both NA and in EU. And he also kind of, just to give you guys the context, he kind of like embraced being an import. Like, he was like, I'm going to learn English and I'm going to... Yeah, exactly. Poult is just like this, right? The GM. So they actually are pretty close friends. And he basically embraced, like, I'm going to speak English as much as I can. I'm going to, be cool with the Western fans. I'm going to be like, yeah, I'm the Korean guy winning your region, but I also want you to like me. And I'm going to try to interact with you.
Poult was a university in Texas, I think, too.
Yeah.
So
Poult is actually like super good at English. Like,
yeah,
I'd say much better than Stardust. But anyway, Stardust kind of got moved up, and then you had Moment, who has kind of been going. He's been coaching for a while, bouncing between the Challengers roster for T1 and the regular roster. I think he's pretty much involved in like moving people up and down, and he's kind of like the bottom of the barrel coach, but he is still important. He knows the team in and out. He got moved up one spot behind Stardust. You could see on stage, Stardust was there on stage, but every time the game ends, when you go back into the coaching booth, like, it's always Moment who's got like the monitor and he's pointing to things and he's saying this and this and this, right? Can't hear what he's saying, but you could tell he's the one who's like making the decisions. And that's where we are now. So that's kind of like, I guess, the whole timeline from start to finish. Poult did say, I guess, in the GM interview that or the press conference, I should say, where he was speaking on as GM, that he felt like he didn't want to answer questions about how the players felt about the coaching decision, and that he said that they didn't have any plans to get any new coaches at the moment. So basically, like, this is kind of it for now, which was the scariest part of the press conference for me, because I thought this was going to be an interim kind of temporary thing.
Yes.
And he also said, like, please don't bother the players about their thoughts on this. And that was kind of like the gist of the press conference. He also said that the decision was not made while talking to the players.
Thing to say in a press conference as well, like, please, media, don't ask questions of any of the players that get paid millions. Like, oh, sorry, yes, sir. Like, what? Okay.
He did also say he did also say that the decision was made. This is according to Ashley Kang, by the way. I was not actually at the press conference. I'm just kind of quoting her tweets because she was watching the press conference and was tweeting out about it. He did say that basically it wasn't his decision, or rather it was not with the player's decision that he made this choice, or that the org, including Joe Marsh, which he did specifically mention, made this choice. It was kind of like separate from the players. He said, I thought it would be unprofessional to actually ask the players what they thought directly about it. I'd rather just make the decision separately from them. So that's like all the timeline, all the info. I think I'm not missing any details here.
I heard he just had Jack make the decision 2 months ago, but it just took a while to, come down the pipeline, one of those like vacuum tubes or something.
Yeah, and also, like, he did say that Joe Marsh did have some input on it. Like, the implication was there, that they, at least we can't know if this is Poult, running interference for Joe Marsh, who made the decision, or if at least Joe who is in charge of all of T1's teams. He's the CEO of T1, I believe. Or whether he made the decision and then, like, Joe approved it. We don't really know.
I'm hurt people's feelings now because I don't give a fuck if this guy's the CEO. The whole premise of why he was supposed to be exempt from all the LS criticism was that he's just the American guy and the Koreans handle it all. But now all of a sudden he's making decisions. By the way, what qualifications does he have to know if someone's a good coach or not? Now, true, Poult could tell you, I don't think he's doing a good job, in which case, by the way, effectively Poult made the decision, you just signed off on it. So I'm done with PR speak, by the way, in esports. Like, I'm not in esports industry. I just work in the games and just you can't get rid of me. So there's all you need to know about that.
That's fair. But what was so interesting is that to go back to rewind time a little bit and why this situation seems so ridiculous now and why, Wolf, you and I were discussing this on Twitter, is that the premise that they set up themselves with the 10-player roster in spring was that, oh, this is a long-term, this is a long-term project. We're swapping people out, even though it's pretty obvious, like, which is the group of the 5 best players that should be playing, because we're playing the long game. So to not even finish the season, if you're playing the long game, just destroys all of the fucking bullshit that they said earlier, because as management, now the coaches may have still been invested in playing that long game, right? But if you as management sign on to that plan, you have to see it through. You don't come when there's like, you've already played 10 matches in the summer split. It's right before you go to Worlds. You've only got, 4 or 5 weeks left of LCK. And you say, no, now basically we're bringing up these coaches that have no or very little rapport with our current players. You have to look at T1 as effectively being a player-run team and a player-coach team at this point in time.
Yeah.
And people will look at it and they'll say, oh, well, they won both of their matches after doing that, which obviously we will be discussing. And they did look better. This is true. But it doesn't make sense from a managerial perspective as to why you empower these coaches' decisions and then destroy them at the last possible minute. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the best choice, even though they won their matches this past week.
Yeah, and I think before we get into that, I will say, like, it's really easy to use, like, this, like, weird sort of confirmation bias if you were a big proponent of getting rid of these coaches to look at just 2 best of 3s in 1 week of League of Legends. In a very tumultuous time, by the way, in LCK history.
And they
where
should have probably lost the Dom one, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit. But it does seem to be, to me, and I said as much, when I responded to your tweet, Monty, that and you just said the same thing, is that the players will kind of run this team for the rest of the season. We'll see what happens. Now, when I made that tweet, I didn't know that Poult was going to say, a few hours later that they are not planning on getting any new coaches, which I guess on one hand, like, I kind of like, maybe, and now that I think about it more, call. because if you try to bring in a new coach right now, then you're starting to put this plan into motion in this long-term idea. There is no long-term. There's not enough time. We're past the halfway point of the season. And then there's going to be a Worlds Gauntlet that you're going to have to fight through, because I don't think T1 is going to win LCK. That seems very unlikely. It is entirely possible, but very unlikely. So you have to go through the Gauntlet, then you have to go through Worlds. So, like, there's not enough time to actually set that up, and to put Stardust in a position.
You would have to be insane to come in as an outside of the organization coach at this point in time, because the expectations are huge, and you have to undo all of this damage that we were talking about in the spring as to why are they doing this in the first place. And you're dealing with the most decorated player of all time in Faker and trying to win his approval with a few weeks remaining in the season. This is a coaching suicide mission.
There's only one person. There's only one person in that team house. Well, there's literally one person in that team house since the coaches were terminated, who actually has the experience and the knowledge to lead this team to an LCK finals, maybe a title, and Worlds. And that person is Faker. It's Faker, right? He's the only person, right? And he has enough experience and I think he's matured a lot as a player and just as a person over the years. I mean, you could tell it in his interviews. He is the person who could lead this team. And we call this, there's a term for this in Korea called playing coach, which exists outside of Korea too, but it's pretty rare, where you actually coach while you play. Runner was one of the more famous ones in Overwatch, for example. Was very briefly only a player while he was coaching. It is possible that he kind of takes over the team, and then Stardust and Moment are kind of like his coaching staff, right? Like that might actually be something that happens behind the scenes. We can't assume that. But I think that he will kind of de facto become, whether he wants to or not, the leader during this time, because Stardust Stardust has not actually done anything of great merit as a LoL coach yet, right? He's played, on big stages in StarCraft 2. He's won titles, but he hasn't actually coached a 5-man League of Legends roster. Now, he knows a lot of the inner workings of the team because he's been here for, the majority of this year, but that doesn't mean that necessarily he can step into, Dany's shoes in terms of drafting, coaching, Zephyr in terms of leadership, and say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to get this team to a championship, right? And I mentioned on the cast, but it was kind of hilarious that at that intense moment where they faced Damwon Kia, Koma's like got his arms folded on the other side, like looking across, going like, "What happened to T1?" It seems everything's in a little bit of disarray. But I did not have faith, and I still don't have faith that they will be able to do it. Moment in Stardust right now, but you can't get a new coach, and it felt like ripping these coaches out right now, like right when they were on the cusp of success. I think feels like, even though it's been almost a year or almost 2 seasons, right? 2 seasons being the year of League of Legends. It's been almost a, competitive year of League of Legends. I think it was like too soon to actually pull them away there, because you have to like go all in on this. If your whole plan for the whole year is like, okay, we're going to use this 10-man roster. We're going to experiment. We're going to get the perfect final roster with some tweaks, right? To Gumushi and Teddy kind of swapping around. Who knows if owner coming in for jungle was even something on the cards. It could have been on the cards before the coaching swap, even though we only saw it afterwards. Like, they
could have been scrimming with him all week and had every intention of putting him in.
Exactly. To stop it like right there, I think it's such an insane risk. And yeah, it might work out, and they might go to Worlds, and everyone will be like, well, I guess it was the right choice after all, even though that might not necessarily be the case. But knowing what we knew, out from the outside looking in, at that point, it felt like the craziest decision that anyone has made all year.
Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.